lunch lecture within the series. The other ones you could find on the Teams meeting for the people from PARATUS, and also in the Moodle directory for the students from the University of Vienna. In this seventh lecture, we are happy to have Marc van de Homberg and Lotte Savelberg from the Netherlands Red Cross, 510 global organization that deals with the data management within the Red Cross. And they would be presenting methods and examples of qualitative risk analysis. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to, I think, Marc, you will start, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kees, for inviting us to give this, let's say, guest lecture in the whole series. And yeah, indeed, my name is Marc van den Homberg. I'm the scientific lead of 510. I'm with 510 since 2016. And I will explain a little bit more about 510 later on. I've been with 510 since 2016, and we're also a part of the PARATUS project. And maybe I'll also let Lotte introduce herself quickly. Lotte will also present later on a part, so then you have also met Lotte already.
Thank you, Marc. Yeah, my name is Lotte. I graduated with 510 last year, and I work here as a data translator and data analyst since September. And I work partly for the domestic department, so really doing data work for the Netherlands Cross within the Netherlands, and partly for the international 510 work, where I work on multi-hazard and crisis zones and the PARATUS project. Thanks, Marc. Back to you.
Thanks. We also really hope that we can make it as interactive as possible. Of course, let's say we have prepared, I think lots of, let's say, content to present, but really do not hesitate to interrupt us and ask questions in the chat, or even preferably, let's say, raise your hand and put on your camera and explain who you are and ask your questions so that we can really have a dialogue. Do really not hesitate to do that. If I might not see the raised hands, then I hope also others can help me in pointing that out, because if I now will share full screen, I might not see everybody raising his hands or her hand. But then, let me start. Well, the official title is Qualitative Risk Analysis, but as you will see during the lecture, we are also working on quantitative methods. But we will also see how this relates then to the lecture. I think it's next week that goes more deeply probably into quantitative risk analysis, but also we are approaching risk in a relatively, let's say, quantitative way. The objectives, let's say the brief introduction, the starting up, and then I would like to take you along to introduce to you the Red Cross world. It's quite a multi-headed beast, and also introduce them 510 so that you can maybe better understand where we are coming from. And then I would like to introduce anticipatory action and how this links to risk assessment. It's a bit the specific angle we have selected for this lecture. Of course, you can do risk assessments for many different reasons, more general, also for disaster risk reduction, for example. But we have chosen to link it specifically to anticipatory action. Then we will explain how to construct a risk index using a hierarchical equal weighting approach. But Lotte will then also show actually right away why that's, let's say, not the only approach, and why there are also certain risks associated with this approach, using a case study in Burkina Faso. And then we will, let's say, move along with these risk assessments and explain more of how we use them in anticipatory action. And hopefully we will have plenty of room for discussion. So the learning objectives, I already mentioned the first one. And actually also the second one. The third one in terms of learning objectives is that I will also give a few examples of how we can use artificial intelligence and big data to bridge the data gap that we are facing in especially developing countries, and how we can use this to get data on some of the risk indicators. And we will also want to explain which methods are available to calculate the risk index and what are their limitations. But let me start by the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. This diagram kind of shows the whole movement, that it consists of 192 national societies, as you can see at the bottom right. These 192 national societies are governed by the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies. And apart from that, we also have the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they are the part of the Red Cross that works in conflict-affected areas. So the International Federation and the national societies, they work mostly in or on natural hazards and disasters. 510 is now, let's say, a part of the Netherlands Red Cross, but you can also say that 510 is part of the Red Cross Red Crescent Research Centers. So we have a nice acronym for that, RC3. And maybe some of you might not be aware of this, but within the Red Cross there are many of these research centers. Maybe some of you have come across the Climate Center already, as they are also a partner in PARATUS. And yeah, they do lots of, let's say, important work also in terms of influencing policies around the world in terms of climate change. But yeah, we have also centers on other topics like the Psychosocial Center or a research center specifically from ICRC. About 510. Our aim is to improve the speed, quality, and cost effectiveness of humanitarian aid by creating products using data and digital tools. And 510 million square kilometers is the total surface of the Earth. And we have chosen this name because we aim to help every national society in need anywhere, and that, let's say, wants support in terms of data and digital. We were founded in March 2016 with a core team of 3 people. And yeah, we have not stopped growing, let's say, until now. We are now at around 45 staff members. We have on average 15 master thesis students and interns a year, and around 60 professional volunteers. For example, people that work in the private sector using data science and that want to help us out. We combine multiple skills and disciplines. So in that sense, we really have a more transdisciplinary approach because we let ourselves be guided by the, let's say, what is needed, what is the problem that Red Cross national societies are facing, and often you cannot solve that with just one, let's say, scientific discipline. So we use, for example, geosciences, political sciences, data science, and human-centered design. Then shortly about the themes we are working on. I already mentioned anticipatory action, and I will explain more about that later on. We also work on cash aid because a lot of the donors in the humanitarian sector, they want that the aid that we are given is a cash-based assistance, because this also increases their resilience and dignity of people, because they can decide themselves how they use the cash. We work on digital transformation. This relates to making Red Cross national societies, let's say, more data savvy and more digitally mature. Emergency support. We work, for example, on automated damage assessments, also with ITC, Professor Norman Kerle. How can we use satellite imagery to identify the areas that are most affected? So we do this remotely, but we have also people deployed. So currently, for example, we have people of our team based in Turkey to support there with information management. And we have had people before in the Ukraine, Haiti, and yeah, let's say all around the world. Water and landscape refers to the work we are doing on, for example, nature-based solutions, to see also more on the long term, what can we do to reduce the impact of climate change, for example. Here you can see also the kind of topics and the tools that we have. but I will not go into this very much detail. But I do want to show the tools that we have developed specifically for anticipatory action. So you can see that here. We have developed a tool that's called Community Risk Assessment Dashboard. And we have developed a tool for impact-based forecasting. So IBF stands for impact-based forecasting. And then we have developed an IBF portal, it's called. Well, because the topic of this lecture is mostly around risk. Yeah, you can see in red where I will focus on. So it's linked to the disaster preparedness phase and the early warning, early action part of the, let's say, the preparedness phase. So just before the disaster response. Yeah, what is actually currently the situation in the work humanitarian agencies are doing? Right now, humanitarian funding is available for response within countries, but also at the global level. There are funds from the UN and funds within the Red Cross, like the Disaster Response Emergency Fund, that allow us to work on helping people once a disaster has struck. But what especially the Climate Center has initiated, I think, and they started with this around 10 years ago, is to say, like, can we also use this funding to trigger early actions and to execute them before the disaster strikes? And for this, we need to be able to forecast which areas of people will be most impacted. And actually, both the UN and the Red Cross have now mechanisms in place to release this funding and to have these early actions for a multitude of hazards. But to do this anticipatory action, we need to develop triggers. And to develop these triggers, there are several steps that we have to take. And what you see here on this slide is on the left, the 4 components of a normal, let's say, early warning system. So probably you have come across this already in one of the other lectures. But we have a component around risk knowledge, about the detection, monitoring, and forecasting of the hazard. Then there's the warning and dissemination component, and the preparedness or the response capability component. And actually, these steps that we take to develop triggers for early action can be mapped onto these early warning system components. And the first step is really that we need to understand more in general the risk in the area for which we want to develop the triggers. So we need to, let's say, expand the risk database. I will now dive into this first step, and later on I will explain also the step 2, 3, and 4. This slide actually still shows a bit more general, like what kind of disciplines we need. And you can see again that we need multiple disciplines to work on these early warning system components. And you can see on the right side also that we can reuse many different data sources. So let me start with the risk database. There are different methods to construct a risk index. There is a deductive method where you use, for example, around 10 different indicators to construct an index. There is the hierarchical approach from, well, as I will explain later on, from, for example, INFORM from the EU Joint Research Center, where every indicator has an equal weight. And there is the inductive approach, such as a principal component analysis. And actually, Lotte will explain more about these two approaches, the hierarchical and inductive approaches, and how they compare. I will now just show you for the hierarchical approach how we can set up this index. So here you see the data framework for the INFORM index for risk management. You can see that there are 3 dimensions: hazards and exposure, vulnerability, lack of coping capacity, and then different categories and components. And this is a multi-hazard risk framework. You can also actually use this for making a single hazard risk index. Then you, let's say, including the multiple risk or hazard components, as you can see here. Here we have earthquake, floods, tsunamis, tropical cyclones, and so on. But then you only select one there. And it also means that your other components, such as, for example, the physical and social vulnerability, should be tailored to this specific hazard. What we have done with this multi-hazard, let's say, index, is that we have developed a dashboard for multiple countries by, let's say, collecting secondary data, all the different risk indicators. Then we integrate them into this index. And yeah, we can calculate a risk index at different administrative levels of a country. So that you can see on the right, this is the data visualization part of it. And for Malawi, for example, yeah, we have done this at these different levels. So you have the national level, then you can go down to 32 districts. Then there are 367 traditional authorities, as it's called in Malawi, and they have around 9,000 group village heads. But as you can maybe imagine, the more we go down towards this village level, the less data is available. And in this approach, we want to have national coverage. So even if we have data for a few villages, we usually do not use that in this dashboard because that would be, let's say, or given an unequal way of comparing then villages with one another. So we only use the data that we have for all villages in constructing this index. So this gap in data at the community level is larger in some developing countries, or definitely larger in some developing countries than in, for example, Europe. So we have also been thinking about how can we bridge this gap. Until now, we have mostly used secondary data, so data collected by another organization that is already, let's say, available through, for example, geospatial data repositories. But yeah, we can also work, of course, on primary data that is collected for the first time. So here you can see, for example, Red Cross teams going out to do household surveys or conduct focus group discussions. But yeah, the primary data collection is still difficult to include because of this national coverage issue, as I explained before. But let me then show an example of how we improved the exposure data in our risk assessments at the national level. So what we did is organize mapathons. Also at ITC, we have been organizing mapathons in the past. And actually then we ask, for example, students or yeah, employees of a company to help us in return for pizza and Coke to manually trace and label buildings in aerial imagery. So at the bottom, you can see how a task in OpenStreetMap looks like. Well, and for Malawi, in the 1 year that we worked on organizing these mapathons between October 2016 and October 2017, we were able to add 3 times as much buildings and roads yeah, on the map, let's say. But at the same time, you can imagine that this is quite cumbersome. To organize these mapathons, you need to validate what people are doing. So usually you have 3 people that trace the same building, and then you have a validator that validates this. So it's all quite time consuming. So automatic building delineation is, of course, a way forward if you want to speed up this process. And yeah, we have been working on this, and it actually works quite well nowadays if you have high resolution imagery. And also the yeah, the GAFA, the Google and Microsoft, the big companies, tech companies are working on this. So there is more and more building delineation data nowadays available through Google Open Building and Microsoft Bing.
Mark, can I ask a question
Yeah,
here?
sure.
with the mappathons, is it also have you experience of involving the local stakeholders in it, like universities from the countries themselves or other stakeholder groups in this work?
Yeah, very good question, because indeed that well, we have not, let's say, scientific evidence, but we do have yeah, experience that if we involve local people in this mapping, that the quality of the mapping is better because they can more easily yeah, distinguish certain features, for example, because they are known to the environment, let's say. So, for example, in Mali, we have been working on this. And also OpenStreetMap has a kind of a way to do this offline. So you can organize mapathons also if you have not good Wi-Fi and still have, let's say, multiple people work on this in an offline way. Let's see in the chat if I have other questions, maybe. No. Okay. Yeah, this picture is maybe a bit difficult, but I will try to explain it. It links back again to this primary data. Yeah, we have been trying to explore also an approach to fill these gaps by not only relying on this more, let's say, big data, but still to have, let's say, social sciences or qualitative approaches to understand better some of the risk indicators through key informant interviews or crowdsourcing Red Cross volunteers. So, yeah, it's a kind of we do not manage with this qualitative approach to reach and this national coverage, but we can use it to inform, for example, which indicators we want maybe to add to the hierarchical framework. So in that sense, this let's say, engaging with communities or with local experts can help us in some cases to add a certain indicator to the framework. Especially for an epidemic risk indicator in Mali, we have done this. We discussed there with local experts and doctors, and in that way we added a few additional indicators to the framework, for which we then try to use, let's say, those more global data repositories to find data on these indicators. Yeah, here you can see where we have developed this dashboard so far, and yeah, maybe we can take a, let's say, also a very short break during which you can maybe have a look at this dashboard, and then yeah, if there are any questions on this, we can maybe discuss this. I can also share actually an Excel file to, I hope it works in the chat, by the way. But then you could, in this Excel file, see how we construct and calculate this risk index.
Mark, there is a question from Till.
Okay. Sure, go ahead, Till.
Hey, Marc, thank you very much. I was just wondering, how do you differentiate the different catchments? Do you base it on natural borders, the catchment in the dashboard, or do you have districts from the local government? I don't know, there might be a conflict then between national borders, natural borders.
Yeah, that's maybe you pinpoint right away a limitation of the approach using the inform index, but then we always use administrative boundaries, which are of course yeah, rather artificial. Yeah, and I know of, for example, research of Stefan Kienberger from the University of Salzburg. He has been working on geons to kind of, can you not find more natural ways to group yeah, and find homogeneous zones of risk, let's say. And maybe catchments is indeed could be for flood risk a way to do this. But for other hazards, it might be that you need other ways of grouping. So for example, for food security, we often use livelihood zones. Because if people have the same pattern of livelihood zones, then yeah, for food security risks or let's say yeah, the risk of people that they will be food insecure, you could use more livelihood zones, for example.
I have also a question, Mark. Are you collaborating with other international organizations that use the same approach for other countries? Because, for example, we've been working with UNESCO, and they have developed similar dashboards for a whole range of countries in Southeast Asia, which is, I think, also UN. The GRIP was also involved in Geneva.
Okay.
I could send
No,
you the link.
really in the beginning, in the 2016, 2017, we were involved in the Informs, well, just kind of steering committee or like a kind of a committee where they ask users to give feedback. But yeah, the last years we have not continued with that. I know that the Inform risk index is now also available at subnational level, but that is still quite high administrative level. But they are trying to go down towards other levels. So yeah, we have been mostly working together with Inform, I have to say. So UN OCHA is leading this. So yeah, that has been our main point of contact until now. Let me share the link to the dashboard in the chat. I right away want to emphasize that this is, of course, just one of the, let's say, many dashboards around risk. There is also one that UNDRR is currently working on. It's called RIGS. So I'll share that one as well in the chat. And then you have, of course, the UN OCHA subnational index. And for us, the important part now is also to decide in how we go forward with the community risk assessment dashboard that we built, because the data has to be refreshed often. As you can see, the dashboard now considers risk to be a kind of a static index, but actually it's of course very dynamic. It might differ a bit per dimension, so maybe in some rural areas the population density or the housing density will, or the exposure part will not change that much. But for example, it's quite clear that in urban areas with rapid urban growth, exposure will change very rapidly. And I think most of these risk indices and risk dashboards are lacking this dynamic component because it's not that easy to, of course, update the data that quickly, especially if the data is simply not available. But even if it's available, it's not that easy to automate it. But yeah, we're looking into this now. In some cases, there are APIs so that you can automatically upload new data on some of the risk indicators. But lots of the data can only be obtained by, for example, contacting the National Statistics Office. So yeah, that requires more in-country work, let's say. Let me still share also the Inform subnational risk link. Maybe any questions already when people have a look at these dashboards?
I have a question, if I can.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Do you collect data also from maybe crowdsource platforms? So I've been reading about open source platforms where not much in the risk phase, but more on the emergency phase. Citizens are sharing information about, an example, flood risk, or like they share information real time, and then the data is saved in the platform. So right now there are some platforms that have been working since some years. So do you also, I don't know, have that input, like collect that data, or not, just from statistics and official ones?
Not so much for these kind of risk assessments that I've just showed. They are more at this kind of country level and more in general to find out which areas of a country are more prone for floods, for example, or where are the people that are more vulnerable. Then we have also our impact-based forecasting portal, which is more, let's say, real time. And there we have now the request from Red Cross National Societies if we can incorporate also this kind of crowdsourced data, because a lot of the data that we show is quite, let's say, high level. So people would like to, and maybe we can show it. So now I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but this is the impact-based forecasting portal that we developed for the Philippines. So what we show in this dashboard is, for example, it's today the 3rd of May, and then this dashboard would give the forecast for the 9th of May. Well, currently actually there are no typhoons forecasted to arrive in the Philippines, so that's why, yeah, I cannot show that much actually, because this is a live dashboard. But if there would be a typhoon approaching, then we would show for a few days ahead where the typhoon would arrive. And then actually what the Philippine Red Cross and for example the Uganda Red Cross for floods have asked us is to then also include in this dashboard not only this kind of risk information and forecasting information coming from global models, but also observations from people on the ground, so that they kind of can ground truth this more official or scientific data with observations from people on the ground. So that's something we are working on. I can not really let's show it yet, but the idea is that we can really show here also kind of, let's say, a pop-up from somebody there, a Red Cross volunteer who has taken a picture or who has done a reading of a flood gauge, so that we have a way to kind of ground truth.
Thank you.
But that's specifically from our perspective. I know that, of course, like EASA is working also on initiatives like this with citizen science. So in Europe, there are more examples.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Go back to the lecture. So let me see. I cannot. Oh, no, it was a bit too far. Yeah. Then I have to see. I saw that I cannot share to the Teams chat right now an Excel file. So I have to see if I can maybe put it on a Google Drive and share it that way. But yeah, we have an Excel file that we can share with you, so you can play around with it to see how we then really do such a calculation. Because there are a few steps like transforming data ranges to a scale of 0 to 10. Yeah, and it might be good to once see how you do this calculation.
Marc,
yeah,
if you
it's maybe
share it with
sure.
me, then I will share it through the Teams and the Moodle.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do so. The question is a little bit, shall I already for now give the floor to Lotte, and then after Lotte's presentation, we come back to this exercise? Is that an option? So that mean in the meantime, we can prepare
That's okay.
everything?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me do that. Maybe Lotte is handiest if you share your slides so you can click through it yourself. Because,
Yeah,
okay, let me
that's
maybe
a good
also
idea.
introduce it, because so far I've been discussing this hierarchical approach. But yeah, is this actually the most adequate? So yeah, let me hand over to Lotte, and in the meantime, together with Kees, I can prepare the exercise.
Okay, give me 2 seconds to share my screen. Can anybody let me know if you are able to see it right now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, super, thank you. Yes, thanks, Marc, and also thanks for inviting me here to share some insights with you. As Marc already mentioned, I looked into different approaches and methodologies to characterize social vulnerability. And social vulnerability is one of the subcomponents of the risk equation. This research started last year because the ICRC in Burkina Faso asked us to develop a better understanding of how climate change and conflict interact and how they influence the livelihoods of the people in country. And very soon, what Marc just told us is that the ICRC, they uses the risk rankings to prioritize communes and regions for project allocation. So the research question I used eventually was, how can we actually calculate a social vulnerability index that characterizes the spatial and temporal dynamics of social vulnerability? As Marc already referred to with the hierarchical inform approach, it is really difficult to keep all the information updated, and also there are some challenges in showing the temporal dynamics of social vulnerability. So when I started with my research, I wanted to find out what other methods are out there that can actually characterize these dynamics in a better way. And I wanted to go away from the standard Red Cross work that always uses the inform approach to see what are then actually the differences. So I looked into methods that provide us with the possibility to give a spatial explicit result of the vulnerability, so we know which areas to focus on, that make it possible to compare how this vulnerability changes over time. That is feasible in low data environments. Marc just showed us a map of on what level we have data, and it showed us that really often we lack a lot of information sources to provide a thorough analysis. And lastly, we wanted to find a method that is very transparent in decision making. So when we show the results to policymakers and project managers that work on the ground in local communes, it becomes really easy for them to understand how we assess the vulnerabilities. So based on these 4 requirements, I assessed 2 methodologies. The hierarchical approach that is always used by many international organizations. So with many, you can think of WHO, UNOCHA, the World Bank. They use this inform approach to prioritize areas for help. And it's a method that is being developed day by day by the European Union. They have now included the climate risk in the index as well. And it's very easy to execute. As you can see from the figure, it makes a lot of sense. So you have indicators that determine socioeconomics, you have indicators that determine demographics, and you have indicators that determine special needs. And all of them are summarized into one number. Secondly, I looked into the inductive approach, more specifically the social vulnerability index that is developed by Suzanne Cutter. This is a statistical approach. So you take all the indicators together and you use principal component analysis to develop factors that you then summarize. This is better to compare over time. And since you don't have to make any manual decision on which indicators you will aggregate together in a sub-index, it's less vulnerable for assumptions and mistakes made by the modeler. And because it's a statistical approach, it already considers double counting. So I used both methods and the same data set to develop social vulnerability numbers for Burkina Faso in 2020. And what we found is the following. So if we look into the principal component analysis, the inform analysis, this is the risk map we obtain. You see a lot of communes at high risk in different areas of the country. When we zoom into the results with the principal component analysis, this is the map that we obtain. And you can see that we actually found very different vulnerable communes. And at first we thought, well, it makes sense because the absolute value of the vulnerability is different. So it doesn't really matter if it's different as long as the ranking is the same, because based on these rankings, we make the humanitarian decisions. Well, looking at the top 10 of most vulnerable communes, we found these two lists of communes. On the left for the inform approach and on the right for the principal component approach, the social vulnerability index that is developed by Cutter. And we found an entirely different ranking of top 10 most communes, which was rather shocking to us because this suggests that if you use a different method for your decision making, the money and the aid will go to entirely different communes within a country. So this is just the top 10 of the communes, but in total there are 351 communities in Burkina Faso. And if we look at the difference in ranking between all 351 of them, this is the graph we obtain. You can see in this Senkai diagram on the left side, the ranking groups with principal component analysis, and on the right side with inform. And you can see that of the 20 most vulnerable communes with principal component analysis, some of them rank in the 225 to 330 least vulnerable communes with inform, which of course has quite big implications for decision making. So we thought, is there any pattern in this? But we really cannot derive any pattern that predicts why a community is considered very vulnerable when using the PCA approach and not very vulnerable when using inform. So of course our second thought was, well, let's check what is right with reality. And then we found out that only 11.6% of all vulnerability research is validated with reality. This kind of makes sense because social vulnerability is not something that is directly measurable. But if these are the differences in methodologies to assess it, it makes a lot of sense to start developing a way to validate these methodologies. So we developed some recommendations for the scientific field, namely to actually discuss how we should use these social vulnerability indices. At this moment, the indexes are often used to make very strict policy decisions that have quite drastic consequences, why this research shows that we don't really know what is the truth. Also, it's really important to collaborate with mathematicians to find approaches that present what we want it to represent in a good way. It's important that we validate the indices that are made and that we understand the drawbacks and benefits of quantifying social vulnerability. So we started with zooming in on the drawbacks and benefits of the two methods that I assessed, the inductive and the hierarchical approach, the inductive being the principal component analysis and the hierarchical approach being the inform analysis. So what you saw on the map is that both are very well able to make a spatial explicit analysis. But what you also saw is that the hierarchical approach is way more transparent. There is not this statistical black box where a lot happens and all indicators are transposed into new axes, which makes it way more easy to understand. Another big advantage of the hierarchical approach is that you only need a relatively low data resolution. You can't use an inductive approach on a country or on a subnational level because you need a lot of data points to make a statistical assessment. However, one of the big advantages of the inductive approach is that through the statistical approach, the methods are more precise and better to compare over time. And I also think that the inductive approach is more objective since you don't have to make disaggregative decisions based on a modeler's bias. We started as humanitarians to write down what we wanted to represent to start the discussion. And we think that social vulnerability should be a construct to guide policy making. but also it should describe a pattern rather than a quantitative value. It's very important to realize that these indexes never show a ground truth. It's just a pattern in which you compare the different communes towards each other instead of being a quantitative meaning on itself. And I think it's very useful to understand the dynamics of vulnerability and also to find a method that can represent these dynamics so we know how it changes and if policy measures have been successful. And lastly, I think it's very important to realize if such a quantitative approach that we use to make qualitative decisions, if that is the right way to do it, because very often on such a very specific local scale, the local experts and the project managers have a very good understanding of the local dynamics of vulnerability. So is it therefore actually necessary to make such a spatial explicit quantification? And that is where I would like to end this presentation, and also for you to take these questions and thoughts into account when going into the exercise that Marc developed. And then we are very curious to hear your opinions on these differences in approaches and the usefulness of such a quantitative versus qualitative approach of social vulnerability. Thank you, Marc. Back to you.
Thank you, Lotte. But yeah, maybe we can first.
I see some questions. Yeah, I didn't see them.
Yeah, there are some questions because I hope it was thought-provoking. Oh, you saw a hands up, I guess, or?
I thought I saw a hands up, but I don't see it anymore. So maybe.
Okay. No questions?
Then let's go to the assignment, I think.
Yep. Although maybe to double check with Case, as far as I know, Case, it was not possible, I guess, for you to upload the files itself.
Yes, I did.
Oh, you did?
In the team, in the chat, I put the link to the Google Drive.
You also put a Google Drive?
Yeah, but then I think that is everybody with the link can access that. You don't need to have, yeah.
Okay, then, okay, yeah. Yeah, let me then maybe share.
And I also put it on the Teams site. So both Google Drive and Teams.
Okay. Yeah, it's a bit then a question of, let's say, trying to play around with it, but let me explain what we have done here. Can everyone see now this, let's say, PDF file?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Okay. So let's say in this exercise or in this Excel file, we have taken the example of traditional authorities in southern Malawi. So traditional authority is the name for an administrative unit, like a sub-province. And in this province, there is only, let's say, flood and drought risk. So that's why you can see we only have data on flood and drought in the Excel file. In terms of vulnerability, we have focused on, I have to look a little bit like that, but the, let's say, a poverty index. And in terms of lack of coping capacity, we focused on the travel distance to, for example, health units. So then there are actually then 3 steps that you can do to turn these, let's say, well, we have, what is it, five data sets to let's say, combine them and turn them into a composite risk index. And these 3 steps are, first of all, that we have to kind of pool this data from these 5 different databases together to merge them. And then we have to transform them to, let's say, values between 0 and 10. And then we can calculate this risk index. So, well, I'm not sure if everyone has been able to, let's say, open or download the Excel file. I guess it's maybe good to mention that it would be good if not everyone starts working in the online Google version, because then it gets maybe a bit, let's say, messed up.
Oh, ja, ik had het al gezien, ja.
Ik dacht, je hebt hem wel nodig, of niet?
Ja.
So yeah, let me see if I can have a kind of a hands up if people have been able to download the Excel file. Or any, yeah, Hannah has been able, Cosmina. So it's 3 still. Okay. So like 4 people to now, 4, 5. Okay. Because then and you can start, let's say, playing around with the merging of the data sources. Yeah, by using this VLOOKUP function. So I guess for those of you that have worked with the VLOOKUP function before, this might be kind of easy to grasp. But yeah, here it's also explained on this PDF file how you could do this. So maybe, yeah, I can give everyone a few minutes to try this out for, yeah, especially this first traditional authority. So the TA Kambalame. Yeah, maybe you can have a try if you manage to look up yeah, the data for these 5 different risk indicators, so drought, floods, travel distance, poverty, and so on. Yeah, maybe I'll just give you a few minutes to have a go at this, and then yeah, if there are any difficulties, we can maybe discuss them together. And I'll just keep this slide up so that you can maybe also look at some of the guidance on the slide if it doesn't work. Yeah, and actually for TA Kamalama, maybe I did not explain well, it's already filled in, I guess. So that should make it a bit easier. So you could start with the TA Pemba, to be more precise.
I think there's a question by Amir.
Okay, sure.
No, actually, sorry, I just raised the hand, because that I got the files. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
No question. Sorry.
Well, but you can maybe assume that most people manage to kind of use this VLOOKUP function and to put all the different data sources together in this merge data sources tab. Because then the next step would be to go to the transformation of the scores. So that would be the second, yeah, step 2, let's say, in the sheet. And maybe I can also share the screen of the Excel file. So here you can see then again this same VLOOKUP as you saw here. You see at 2.4, that's still the same. But then in the column H, there is the part where we try to make sure that the scores are within this range between 0 and 10. So you can see we use the minimum value and the maximum value of the whole, let's say in this case, hospital score to work on this. It's maybe good to explain for drought and flood. It was not necessary actually to do this let's say, transformation to a scale between 0 and 10, because the drought score, for example, was already on a scale from 0 to 10. So that's why we are only doing it here for the distance to school, hospitals, and let's say trading center. See, any questions on this part? Because if not, then yeah, we can, let's say, move to the let's say the last part, which is then to go from the transformation to the, let's see, it works. No. Ah, smart. Yeah, let's see, to the calculation of the risk index. So that's the third tab on the, or in the Excel file. So for step 1 and 2, if you fill them in correctly, then this will also show up in the risk score tab. And now, yeah, you can see that how the weighting is done. And it's an equal weighting approach, which means that the different risk dimensions that I showed in the beginning, so coping capacity, hazard and exposure, and vulnerability, they all get, let's say, 1/3 of the weight, so 33%. But then if you have more indicators below a certain risk dimension, the weight for these risk indicators will decrease. And actually understanding this might also help us in understanding why we get differences with the PCA methods, by the way, but that would require maybe some more mathematical discussion. But yeah, normally equal weights are given, but you could actually also now see or check in this Excel file what happens if we give, for example, more weight to flood. So imagine local experts say, well, we think the flood risk is really for us more important than the drought risk. Then you could yourself start playing with the weights. Of course, you change the method then to a more an expert-based weighting method. So you have to carefully document that, I guess. But it's of course a possibility to play around with these weights. Let's see, any questions on this part or no? Okay, then yeah, maybe in view of the time, because we have, I guess, about 25 minutes left, I'll move then to, let's say, the overall slide deck again. Yeah, I hope this was useful. If you play around with this yourself, I think it becomes all a bit more, how to say it, tangible, of how you can construct such a risk index. So let me go back to the slides. And then to skip through the slide from Lotte again. And by the way, Lotte also presented this last week at the EGU conference in Vienna. So yeah, you could have be present there and see Lotte presented live. Let's see. Okay, yeah, back to this kind of trigger development overview. So if you recall, we have now been discussing, mostly about this step 1. So expanding this risk database. But if we want to be able to predict what the weather will do and not what the weather will be, which is basically impact-based forecasting, then we have to go further and also look at the different forecasts of the weather that are available. So we have to make an inventory of forecasts. And it's maybe good to point out that we do this anticipatory action or this forecast-based financing or early warning, early action are all terms that are used to some extent interchangeably. We do this mostly for, let's say, the short-term forecasting and the medium-term forecasting hazards that you can see here. Because, well, for example, earthquakes, it's really hardly possible to predict them. So yeah, you will not have any lead time to take early actions. But if you have hours to days, then of course you can still do something to help people, to evacuate them or to strengthen their houses. So yeah, you can see here that we have been working as the Red Cross on tropical cyclones, landslides, floods, volcanoes, and epidemics. And we have also been working on the more slow onset hazards that you can see in the column medium-term forecasting. So drought or extreme temperatures, for example. So what we usually do is, as part of a feasibility study, make an overview of the different forecasting products that are available, and then do a kind of a forecast skill assessment, it's called. So here you can see an example for tropical cyclones in the Philippines, where on the horizontal axis you see the lead time in hours. So completely on the right is 72 hours, 3 days. And you can see the arrow in the track of the typhoon. And you see all these different model names. So for example, GMA, ECMWF, and they are models from meteorological agencies. So GMA is, for example, the Japanese Meteorological Agency, and ECMWF is the European Center for Medium Wave Frequencies. So they have forecasting products, and what you can see here that they all have their, let's say, errors. But of course, we try then to pick the one that is having the least errors, in this case in the track. So then we have, let's say, made a selection of the best possible forecast. But then what we still want to know is what was the impact of these weather or hazard events in the past? Because only then we can make a model that can predict the impact. So then that means we have to create an impact database. And there is actually also a link of impact to risk. Sometimes risk index can be validated by using impact data. Because risk is, of course, a very latent, let's say, concept. It is not something that you can easily measure, especially a multi-hazard risk index, that you cannot just go into the field and measure if your calculation of the multi-hazard risk index is correct. But for, let's say, a single hazard risk index, you could say, okay, we can maybe validate our risk index by using impact data averaged over maybe 10 or 20 years. So that's actually not a reason to use, or how to say it, to make a good impact database. But yeah, the problem with impact data is that there are multiple data providers, multiple ways of collecting impact data, and in many countries it's, yeah, let's say not easily accessible. But yeah, here you can see some examples of primary data providers of impact of disaster events and the different methodologies that they use. Some are really right after the disaster, and some damage and needs assessments are a bit later, let's say almost into the recovery phase. Then you can have impact data about what's called sometimes losses, so it's really irreversible, or damage which is reversible. Now you can also make distinctions between material, non-material, non-economic and economic type of damage and loss. Here you can see some of the global impact data sources that we use in our work. Well, some of them are actually only accessible behind the paywall, like the Sigma Explorer from a reinsurance company like Swiss Re or Munich Re. So yeah, we don't use those actually. We mostly use MDOT and Deserttar. Then there are country-specific databases. I think the US one, Shelders, is really state of the art. I see a question from Kees.
Yeah, it's just a curiosity. Both these Sigma and NatCat, they are not even for humanitarian purposes. They're not willing to share those with the Red Cross.
Yeah,
They would be theoretically more extensive than the other ones, I think.
yeah. With the German Red Cross actually once arranged for us and the Climate Center access to Munich Re. And I think also Bettina is on the call, so maybe she was involved at that time. But so we got once access to then Nathan, I think it was called at that time actually, their database. But then, yeah, let's say the interesting part, we still did not have access. So, and it was a bit more. There was data on, let's say, insured assets, whereas we are interested in more the poor and vulnerable people. For example, living in slums. So yeah, I had the impression also they have more data on these, more affluent neighborhoods or more, bigger houses, things like that.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I would love to re-explore this and get more access then to that database. We still got, let's say, only access to a limited part of that database. Right, so this was just to show that countries have also their own database. But yeah, often this is not openly accessible. So yeah, for example, in Mali, we asked at the national level, but in the end, you sometimes still have to go to the civil protection agencies at the district level to ask each district individually if they can share the data. So it's quite cumbersome sometimes to get really good impact data from the national level. You also have hazard-specific databases, so that's, yeah, let's say not really impact data, I guess, or in some cases is a bit overlapping. So it has hazard information plus some impact information. So here you can see, yeah, some examples for earthquakes or cyclones. Yeah, then an example of how we use this impact data or how we try to enrich it. So here you can see MDOT data for Malawi on flood and drought risk. And then, yeah, what we sometimes try to do is then to see if we have, let's say, also these national databases that we can use to enrich this. Because we know almost for sure that if we look at this data for Malawi, that is not complete, let's say, that there must have been more events. So yeah, we have been trying to see if we could use text mining. Yeah, we call it our 510 news impact miner. So we scrape online news sources, which are actually then only available from usually 2015 onwards. So that's already a drawback of this method. But okay, from 2015 onwards, we can scrape online sources, and then we can extract impact data from these. And I'm a bit switching between countries, I realize, but yeah, the example here is for Uganda. But what you can see then is that if we do this, then we get more events through these news articles. So spatially, so that you can see on the left top hand, if you compare the top, let's say, map of Uganda with the bottom map, you can see that the news article events are occurring in different places than the ones at the bottom. So yeah, sometimes it helps us to get more, let's say, a better spatial coverage, and sometimes it also helps to fill gaps. Yeah, in Uganda, actually, we had a bit more access to newspaper articles. So here you can see that we also had articles from before, let's say, 2000. So yeah, this can be a way to, let's say, enrich your impact database by this text mining. But yeah, it's definitely not how to say it, a silver bullet. You really have to also carefully compare each individual event before you can kind of put it all together, and also avoid redundancies, for example, in your reporting. Yeah, maybe going back to my let's say, menu for cooking and for the modeling. So we have been discussing these step 1, 2, and 3. So now we have actually all the ingredients for the modeling part. And I will just show the kind of the composite index approach. So it's again related to the methodology you also use for a risk index. And I will show an example of 4C of statistical modeling, because this gives us then this impact-based forecast. So the composite index approach is basically putting one layer on top of the other. So here you can see how we use this risk data again. So if we have prepared in step 1 good poverty data and data on the physical vulnerability, so which houses or exposure, which houses are in the flood-prone areas, then we can combine this with the forecast for example, a flood or a tropical cyclone, and with on top the deployment area of the Red Cross, because in some countries the Red Cross is not, let's say, everywhere active. So then you can really come up with the area where you should start up your early action. So you can see that's also how Bangladesh did it. They were one of the first Red Cross national societies with an early action protocol approved for tropical cyclones. So in 2018 already. And yeah, their, let's say, trigger model is that they use this exposure and vulnerability information from the risk mapping. They combine it with a forecast of the tropical cyclone. And that gives them this kind of priority map on the right. And you can see it's still often quite high level. So it's at, I think in Bangladesh called Upazila level. So it means you still have to kind of decide if there are multiple administrative units affected, you still have to decide how to prioritize among them. And that's often done with the local people, local community leaders to kind of discuss this. So that's a kind of a, let's say, less data-driven project, but by or approach, but more by consulting the local people, that you do the last part of targeting. So that was the, let's say, more basic approach. Our kind of Rolls Royce among this impact-based forecasting modeling is the statistical model that we have developed for the Philippines. It's a machine learning model that predicts 72 hours before a typhoon makes landfall whether 10% or more houses will be totally damaged. And yeah, we do this with a regression model, but you can also work with a classification model actually. And then the early actions that are taken are early harvesting of crops. So for example, rice crop, evacuation of livestock and assets, strengthening houses by using ropes, and in some cases, cash for work. So here maybe still to show a bit the difference between what we call classification and regression. With a classification model, it's really black and white. You just say, are there yes or no more than 10% of the houses affected? Or in case of rice damage, we actually also made a model for rice damage. Is there more or less than a certain percentage of rice fields affected? That you can see on the left, the classification model. You can also have regression. That gives more, let's say, gliding scale of the percentages. And the dotted line in these figures represents the typhoon track. So this is the kind of model we made where we have 41 explanatory variables or predictors. Again, you see the risk information coming back because we have exposure and vulnerability indicators related to, for example, roof type, wall type of the houses, poverty. And we have then the information on the hazards. So in terms of the operational model, this is the information coming from the forecasting center. So in our case, it's, for example, the ECMWF. But for training the model, we use historical data on the different typhoon events. And we have now around 80 in our database. So yeah, this model is trained that way, and it predicts then the damage to houses. And here you can see what it looks like for the Philippine Red Cross. They receive actually every 6 hours a map, like you can see here, showing the percentage of damage per municipality. The tricky part is again that there is uncertainty, of course, in our impact-based forecasting model, but most of the uncertainty is in the hazard forecast. So you see this line on the screen that represents the typhoon track. And maybe you remember also from the forecast scale analysis I showed, the track can be up to 400 kilometers off from the actual track when the typhoon makes landfall. So yeah, that gives still quite some uncertainty. That makes it also, let's say tricky to do early action, especially if you're going to harvest crop, for example, and in the end the typhoon does not make landfall in a certain municipality. That of course might also, let's say, upset people. So yeah, they're not easy decisions to take. We're also working on ways to better visualize the uncertainty in these predictions. Yeah, that kind of showed the step 4. And the step 5 is this generation of the impact-based forecasting intervention map. So that's actually the dashboard that I showed. We have now been developing this for many countries, but let me show it again. There's still, we have still 9 minutes, I see. So if in the meantime there are some questions, then do not hesitate to jump in. See a question from Kees.
I wondered about this automatic text recognition. So normally people do this from social media, but then limited to Twitter. But you are doing it for all text. And have you also been using like these new tools like ChatGPT for these type of things? Would that be a helpful solution for finding historical information?
Regarding to your first questions in terms of social media, in some of the country work, let's say the spread or the adoption of Twitter can be relatively low. Well, Philippines is, for example, where it actually is used a lot, but in countries like Mali, for example, it's not used that often. So that has been one reason we have not been using Twitter. And the social media we are using is kind of the online news media. So it's kind of the national or regional newspapers. So that's what we have been using now. But I know, for example, also of the global flood monitor from the VU Amsterdam. So they have a system where they look at Twitter. I have also understood actually recently that now with the changes in Twitter that it's less easy to get access to the fire hose of Twitter data, but that might also limit in the future maybe this use of this data source. Then to your second question in terms of ChatGPT, no, I guess that's something we still have to explore. And maybe we have to dive into that better sooner than later, so that we have not done yet. This was still to show again this dashboard that I showed before. Actually, it's now, maybe Kees will not like this, it's still single hazard and silo approach. And here you can see the part for the typhoon, but I can also click on the part for floods. And then we have a part for dengue. So actually as part of PARATUS, of course, we hope that we can also move towards a more multi-hazard kind of dashboard. But here it's still in the silo approach. And this shows then also, like here, the layers. We can, again, use some of the information coming also from the risk assessments, such as vulnerable groups, vulnerable houses. So here we use data from the risk assessment. And probably in terms of tooling, we are now going to kind of merge our community risk assessment with this impact-based forecasting portal. And maybe we can show still here. Yeah, that we have done this actually for multiple countries. No, I think I have to log into a separate system, but we have been setting this up for now for almost 10 countries. So what you can see here is, for example, the information from the forecasting agency. And we then also show if there is, if the trigger is reached, we show, for example, also how many people will be affected and will be in the area that will be flooded. Back to the slides again. So yeah, that was, let's say, this step 5, where we generate really an intervention map, but yeah, that has become now a decision support system. See, so yeah, given that we are also almost at the end of the time, yeah, these were the learning objectives. It's probably a bit hard to verify if we have reached them, but I hope yeah, we managed to achieve them to some extent. And yeah, then I would just maybe like to close by doing a small round, or if there are people still that have questions, you can also always reach out to me and Lotte for more information or resources.